That okay? Yes, you are. You want me to wait to unmute myself? Should I unmute myself? Okay. We're good to go? Okay, okay. Right. Good evening. Welcome to the first Stevenson Trust for Citizenship event of this new year, and Happy New Year. I don't know. Nobody can ever decide when we officially stop saying that, can we? But Happy New Year. I'm Christopher Carman. I'm the Stevenson Professor of Citizenship here at the University of Glasgow. And we have quite a few events coming up this semester that I'll just flag up before we get started. So on the 10th of February, we have an event with the Scottish Youth Parliament. Members of the Scottish Youth Parliament will be coming and discussing what the Parliament has done over the last 25 years, because, of course, last year we spent all the time talking about the 25th anniversary of the Scottish Parliament, but we kind of didn't really include the Youth Parliament, so we'll bring them around. And then in March, Professor Sir Anton Muscatelli will come and deliver his final Stevenson lecture as principal of this fine institution. So please just watch for those, if you will. First, though, in 5 days' time, we will see the inauguration of President Donald Trump as the 47th President of the United States. So online discussion of this event ranges from absolutely jubilant to absolutely despondent, with very few people apparently sitting in the middle of that. For Trump supporters, the incoming Trump administration's promises of a one-day shock and awe campaign, that's a direct quote, with over 100 executive orders actioning plans on border security, deportations, vaccine mandates, and complete reform of civil service protections for government workers, promises are many of the day one promises that Trump had put forward during the campaign. For Trump's detractors, on the other hand, they'll be looking for and perhaps fearing the incoming president's promise to act like a dictator on day one and seek retribution. So I imagine many on both sides will be looking to compare Trump's inaugural speech on Monday to the speech that he gave in 2017, which became known as the American Carnage speech. Over the next week or so, we'll see many media stories trying to figure out what Trump's administration will do within the first week and then the first 100 days. But to help us understand what the partisan pundits will be talking about, I'm very happy to say that tonight we are joined by Professor Natasha Lindstaedt of Essex University. Professor Lindstaedt specializes in authoritarian regimes, state failure, and human security. She has written numerous books on those topics, with her latest book looking at authoritarian resurgence and resistance. She has consulted for the European Union External Action Service, International IDEA, and the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. Professor Lindstaedt has taught US politics for many years. And since the Trump era has written extensively on US politics and elections, US foreign policy, and democratic backsliding in the US. With this background, I'm sure you'll agree that she is particularly well placed to give us a clear-eyed analysis of what we can expect. So in discussing the upcoming Trump administration and what it means for US domestic foreign policies and the general state of American democracy, we're going to try something slightly different this evening. Usually, of course, we have the set piece lecture, but tonight we're going to try more of a chat format, in discussion, as it were. We are going to talk through issues about the last campaign and election briefly, then we'll talk about domestic policy. We'll come to you for a few questions, and before we turn to foreign policy and then to the general Q&A. So before we start that, I'll just quickly note, as we always do, that we are recording this evening, and we will put it on our website as soon as we're able for anybody to use. And of course, we, as always, encourage educators to get in touch if they are interested in any of our materials or we can help out in any way. So welcome, Professor Lindstaedt, to the University of Glasgow. And I'm going to now shift and take up a sort of leisurely look here on the chair, not the sofa, next to Natasha. Right. Can you still hear me? Perfect. Great. All right. So welcome. Thanks for coming.
Having me.
Thanks for making the journey up north.
It's great. I appreciate it.
So I want to get started by looking back at last year's campaign and election. Over the course of that campaign, Donald Trump, of course, made all sorts of large-scale promises, right? He promised anything from 20 to 100% tariffs on goods imported into the US. He promised sort of mass deportations of undocumented immigrants. He promised to be, as I mentioned already, the retribution for his supporters. Many of these kind of seemed off the cuff a bit, these promises. So I wanted to start there with you and say, and ask sort of what stood out with his campaign promises, either in terms of sort of substance or even how he went about doing his campaigning.
Right. So there were two things that stood out the most because he was repeating it over and over again. He kept repeating this idea that he was going to deport 11 million people. And this was a signature piece of his campaign over and over again. We're going to deport. It's going to be the largest deportation effort ever. He mentioned that, and he has also was talking about tariffs. He said that he loves the word tariffs, that tariffs is a beautiful word, and that tariffs were going to be the solution to almost every problem. So he was actually asked, what is your childcare plan? What are you going to do to help with childcare costs? And he went on some long, sort of convoluted, I don't know, meandering statement. And then he ended saying that it was going to be tariffs, that tariffs were going to solve people's childcare woes and costs, although he didn't really explain why. And all the while during the campaign, there were various economists that were warning that both plans would be really detrimental to the economy, like particularly when you think about, deporting 11 million people. How are you actually going to do this? Are you going to use your military to go into restaurants and so forth? And you have some 9% of those that are working in the hospitality industry in the US are undocumented workers, 14% of those that are working in agriculture, undocumented workers. An interesting thing I was reading that in the state of Texas, which of course is a deep red state with some pockets of blue or whatever, 50% of those working in the construction industry in Texas are undocumented workers. So there's all kinds of holes to this particular plan, but also with the tariffs plan. I mean, he doesn't understand tariffs very well, that it's actually a tax. And that it's not going to be cheaper for consumers. He was saying that it was going to create more jobs, his tariffs, and through looking at the first term, it didn't create more jobs, that it was going to be better for consumers, and that also proved not to be true. And he said it was going to improve the trade deficit. and that also wasn't true. He was threatening tariffs recently on, two of the US's biggest trading partners and allies, Canada and Mexico, and 60% of crude oil to the US comes from Canada. He was threatening tariffs, of course, also on China. And if you include China, Mexico, and Canada, I mean, these are huge US trading partners. 1.5, like I think it is, I want to make sure it's trillion. Yes, 1.5 trillion comes from those countries that are exporting their goods into the US, and 1 trillion is being exported out from the US to those 3 countries. So, I mean, this would have catastrophic effects on the US economy, but he's repeated them over and over again, and he thinks that they're going to be a panacea for all the problems. So those are probably the 2 things that stand out. I mean, you were mentioning some of the other things of the deep state, that he was going to get rid of tens of thousands of career state employees, civil service, people working in the civil service, people with experience, people that were apolitical, and then he would replace them with MAGA employees who were pledging their loyalty to him, like a form of patronage. I'd heard he wants to roll back environmental regulations. So after Obama, he came in 2017 and rolled back over 100 different regulations on the environment. He plans to do something similar, going, full throttle on drilling, on fracking, leaving the Paris Accord agreement as he did before, and trying to overturn some of these Biden era regulations and trying to pick away at that Inflation Reduction Act, which parts of it dealt with environmental regulations. I know he's going to go after things like studying critical race theory in school, or gender studies, or rolling back LGBTQ rights. These were things that he had talked about. I had heard he's going to try to get rid of the birthright citizenship thing.
Yeah, that's
that's one of the things that he thinks has got to go away. I don't know how easy that's going to be, but I was reading, circling back to the issue of tariffs, I'm reading that he might be able to do that without congressional involvement, that he might find a way to get around that one.
There's a slight difficulty with that one in that it's written into the Constitution, which kind of makes it a little bit difficult.
Are we talking about the tariffs one?
No, the birthright
Yeah,
citizenship.
the birthright one I don't think he can do, but I think
Yeah.
the tariffs one he might be able to do.
He'll have the president has some tariff, but to the level that he's talking about.
Yeah,
I
I don't think he can implement it.
Yeah.
But I mean, like you said, it's shock and awe.
Yeah, that's what.
This just crazy amount of a flurry of executive orders that will get the media's attention, which I think he even said that that's what he wants.
Yep.
And to really make a big splash just within the first 100 days.
Right. So you've laid out a lot that he's going to do, right? And the justification for being able to do all that, he keeps reiterating, is his claims about having won this massive electoral mandate, he says. Some in this room will know that following the election, I did one of these Stevenson lectures where I brought into question this idea that he has the mandate to actually carry these out. Now that we've had 2 months to sort of look back at the election, what is your takeaway from the election and how well he did?
Well, I agree with you that he didn't have a mandate. He won by over 2.5 million votes, but Biden beat him by 7-8 million votes. He won decisively in the electoral college.
Biden in 2020.
In 2020, in 2020. So he won decisively in the electoral college because he managed to win those key states of Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan. But it wasn't by like massive margins, but it was more, it wasn't as close as some people had thought going in. And I think there was quite a bit of enthusiasm on the Democratic side in the night going in that Kamala Harris had a chance to win. So when she didn't win, there was just such despair that it felt like a trouncing. But then once the numbers fully came in from the state of California and other parts of the West Coast, you see that it wasn't a mandate. The entire country did move to the right if you look at all the different counties, and that's definitely true. And the Democrats seem to do better with those with university education. And only 37% of Americans have a university education, and they lost the working class.
Yeah.
And so there seems to be a bigger division in where the Democrats had more of a mix in the past of working class university educated people. Now they seem to be only in terms of the way they talk and the way they communicate, their marketing, whatever their political campaigning seems to be directed at college educated voters. And that's their main support base, whereas Trump's support base comes from non-college educated voters, particularly white non-college educated voters. But he also made some gains with African-American non-college educated voters and a lot of gains with Hispanic non-college educated voters.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So that sets the stage for us for the background for getting into what happens starting on Monday. Right. So we'll stop looking backwards and we'll shift to looking forwards to what happens next week. So Monday is Inauguration Day. And the highlight of that will be at around noon, Trump will take the oath of office and be sworn in. All the former presidents have said that they will attend. Michelle Obama has announced that she will not attend. She's not a former president, though she was. Also in attendance will be Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos, sitting actually just behind the former presidents, apparently.
That's weird, no?
Yeah, that's very weird. Yeah, absolutely. And then there'll be a big motorcade after that's done, after Trump gives his speech. There'll be a big motorcade taking Trump back to the White House. And then Trump will begin the job of running the country from that point on. So you are, in your expertise in your area of background, particularly is authoritarianism. Will Trump be a dictator on day one, as he's promised to be? And if so, what does that even look like?
Right. So I don't see him as a dictator in the sense of like Vladimir Putin, where he's going to be killing journalists and, people will be dying from mysterious poison, Novichok and being thrown out of buildings. He's not that type of dictator. He's more like a wannabe autocrat of some kind of like a hybrid regime. I see him more similar to someone like Viktor Orban, where a lot of the damage done is just in the shift in norms. And we had talked about this a little bit earlier. I mean, we already see the effects of this. So the Washington Post, which had normally endorsed candidates because it's owned by Jeff Bezos, who has become cozier with Trump, and Amazon is worth 2.3 trillion, and he wants his Blue Origin space company to be worth that much. He
made the pilgrimage to Mar-a-Lago.
He made the pilgrimage to Mar-a-Lago, as did some other big industrialist people in the with big corporations. So he refused to allow the Washington Post to endorse a presidential candidate. After the Washington Post was probably one of the best investigative, newspapers in the U.S., uncovering all these stories about Trump and how he's been unfit to be president. I mean, that to me is already very chilling when that happened. The whole case with ABC News, where George Stephanopoulos, who is he's like an anchor on ABC News in the U.S., and he referred to Trump's sexual assault civil case as rape, and some legal experts were saying he was liable for rape, but by saying this, Trump sued and ABC News caved, and they paid $15 million in a settlement.
The Trump's presidential library fund.
Exactly. So, I mean, that already, these kinds of threats to the media, and there will be more, in that a lot of the pathways of autocratization or democratic backsliding isn't that journalists are put in prison, but they just don't report or do what they used to do. They might be afraid of reporting honestly about the news. They may engage in all kinds of self-censorship, and we may see that happening more and more, which is what I'm worried about. But also what some of these heads of big corporations are doing, that they're cowering to him, they're trying to make deals with him, and that everything is so transactional, and they benefit from it. I don't know, we may be getting into this later, but in Trump's first term, the billionaires in the US, they themselves got much richer by about $1 billion, I think, or 1 trillion, sorry,
trillion,
1
yeah.
trillion, not a billion, 1 trillion. Once Trump was elected, the billionaires just in the last several months gained 64 billion. So there's huge benefits for these really ultra rich people in Trump being in power. And they see that they can make deals like Tim Cook of Apple was able to go to Mar-a-Lago, give Trump a few gifts. And then Trump was saying that whatever tariffs that are applied to China aren't going to be applied to some of these Apple products that obviously need some of the Chinese products to produce their final products. So there's all these little things like that happening. The shifting, he's completely just shattered norms about what we think the president is supposed to do. You know, they used to have to give their tax returns. He didn't want to do that. Whether it be something, you know, smaller like that, or just that he refuses to adhere to, you know, the normal norms of Congress and decorum that we are used to, and that were really important forms of civility that you need for politics to function, where he's advising his Republicans not to make deals on giving foreign aid to key allies because that would then make Biden look good. I mean, we didn't have this kind of thing. And of course, the biggest one was what happened in January 6th, that he encouraged an insurrection. Other people went to prison, but he didn't face any form of retribution. And in fact, he was saying it was a lovely day of peace, and faced absolutely no punishment. You have Jack Smith, who was the special counsel who resigned from the Department of Justice. There was several different court cases going on, but because he's politicized the judiciary to such an extent, he was nominating justices, not just the Supreme Court justices, and I know we probably know all what happened there with the Supreme Court justices that he nominated, but with these federal level justices. And he nominated in 4 years more justices than almost as many, not quite as many, but almost as many justices as Obama did in 8 years. He nominated in 4 years. Some of these justices are normal, just sort of justices that might be more to the right. But some of the justices were clearly incredibly loyal to him. One of the notable ones was probably Eileen Cannon, who was the judge in charge of his classified documents case. And she took great risks to her own career, to the integrity of her own position, to stall, to basically throw out the case. And I think she's hoping for maybe a nomination to the Supreme Court if Justice Thomas resigns. So all these judges are more pro-MAGA than loyal to committing to the rule of law. And that worries me. I mean, there's so many things. Yeah. We could go on and on forever about this, but you also don't have a Republican Party that is willing to check him that much. Yeah. I mean, we'll have to see. Yeah. But this is just a sprinkling of, you know, some of the things that come to mind.
Right. So we have the media crackdown, we have the general undermining of the norms, and we have the undermining the rule of law. You mentioned the January 6th protesters and rioters. So there's been a lot of talk about potentially pardoning them. Do you think that that's going to happen?
Well, it was actually you, Chris, that just informed me that they're walking back on that. I mean, I thought it would happen because that was one of the campaign promises, that this was a day, as I mentioned, of love and peace, and that these people were great. And that was also part of the narrative, that day wasn't what we all saw, where depending on who reported, I think the New York Times at one point reported there was 5, 6, 7 people that died. You know, there's still 8 civil suits ongoing from law enforcement officials who face injuries and all kinds of trauma because of January 6th. I mean, metaphorically speaking, Trump is the only president to put a bounty on his own vice president's head, right? When people are yelling, hang Mike Pence, his former vice president, he didn't do anything to stop it, and was saying, you know, Mike Pence, we got to do something about this guy. So he's trying to.
In fact, actually, it's reported, he said, I don't care.
Yeah, he didn't care. Yeah, he didn't care. He's trying to recreate the narrative that this was a great day. I don't really know why he's walking back on it, to be honest, because I thought he would go ahead with it, but maybe there's
The-
divisions within. his-
There's just as of today, there's a NPR Marist poll out to say that 62% of the American public does not want the pardoning of the rioters. And so what I think what we're sort of seeing is they're trying to not entirely walk it back, but sort of nuance it.
Right.
And so JD Vance, who will be vice president on Monday, has said that, well, if somebody's convicted of violence at the Capitol on the day, then obviously they shouldn't be pardoned, but everybody else should be pardoned. So I think that's how they're trying to nuance it a bit on that. So other things that Trump will do on Monday is sign a swathe. Predictions are around 100 or so executive orders. So can you maybe just sort of give us the brief précis on executive orders and what he might do with those?
Right. So, I mean, the brief way of thinking of an executive order is a directive by the president. And it's sort of a way of circumventing, legislative pushback. So I went through a lot of these when I was talking about the environmental regulations that he could do. I mean, he could try to get rid of like a vaccine mandate. He's mentioned that. I talked about the fact that he's going to try to get rid of all these civil servants and the deportations, the rolling back of the environmental regulations and the rolling back of teaching critical race theory and gender theory in schools. So I'm not sure if there's anything that I hadn't mentioned already that he's going to go for. But I think, again, I'll just reemphasize that the centerpiece is the deportations.
Yeah.
He really wants to get this done, and this seems to be what a lot of his base cares quite a bit about.
Yeah, apparently was reporting in the New York Times that they're trying to identify some illness that they can blame on immigrants to allow Trump to then shut down the border. Because of course that's what they did with COVID, right? He used the border was shut down because of COVID. They completely sealed it off and said nobody can come in and no asylum seekers, nothing. And so they're trying to figure out if there's some sort of illness that they can blame on immigrants to do that again. Just for context, executive orders are quite powerful. The United States military was integrated by President Truman, using executive order. And Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency by executive order. So, presidents can do an awful lot with these things, right? And so
Obama used them a lot.
Obama used them a lot. He used, basically, presidents have started using these a lot because they can't get anything through, because Congress is so tied up, right? It can't get anything through because it's so polarized that presidents have just started using executive orders to sort of quasi-legislate what they want. And because Congress doesn't do what it's supposed to, that gives a president latitude. All right, so I'm going to use Congress there as a really rough segue to say this week in Congress, we've started the hearings, the confirmation hearings for Trump's nominees. So the various people that he's nominated to run all the various cabinet level departments. Those all have to be confirmed by the Senate. This is a constitutional provision. Under the advise and consent feature of the U.S. Constitution, the Senate has to confirm Trump's nominees. Reporting as of today seems like most of these should actually get through, right? There were a few that people were quite skeptical about. Pete Hegseth for defense, for instance, looks like he'll probably get confirmed, despite being the most unqualified person ever to be nominated to run the Department of Defense. But it looks like Trump is going to create all sorts of positions for people who won't require Senate confirmation. So he's going to create, supposedly, the Department of Government Efficiency.
It's ironic,
yeah. Create a whole department and staff it up to figure out how to save money.
It's a duplication. You have the Office of Management
budget.
Yeah.
Yep. And the Auditor General and. So it's supposed to be run by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. They've already hired people for this thing, apparently.
No, I had heard that the people working there will have to work for free, or is that not the case?
They're being paid by the transition.
Okay.
So Donald Trump's transition has raised over 150 million, to the point where actually his transition fund, sorry, I'm sort of now extemporaneously speaking here. His transition fund actually has cut off massive the $1 million donations that they're getting from the large companies, because they don't have any more spots in the 3 gala balls and anything like that. So they're saying, well, you can give us money, but you don't get to sit behind the president and all that kind of fun stuff. So to what extent, and I guess that when you were speaking earlier about, well, this isn't like Putin, and this is a different sort of authoritarian regime. Of course, we have sort of oligarchy type regimes, right? And so to what extent do you expect Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy and Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos and all the other multi-bazillionaires or whatever they are, what sort of influence are they going to have in the Trump administration?
A huge influence. Yeah, I think we're already seeing that with, I mean, Elon Musk really came out of nowhere in terms of being part of MAGA world. This wasn't years in the making. I mean, more like months. And then suddenly they were best friends, and he was campaigning, and through his control of X, the algorithms were moving in a direction where you're getting a lot of right-wing views that were very supportive of Trump at the time. And Elon Musk had supported Democratic candidates for years. So that was a wild card thing that I hadn't really predicted, but he kind of tied himself to Trump, and he's going to be benefiting greatly. He's already been on the calls, of very important foreign policy calls about Russia and Ukraine, and seems to have Trump's ear on a lot of important things. And Trump has put him in charge of cutting $2 trillion. I don't know if they're going to still try to do that. I think they're walking back on it a little bit.
They originally said, two, and then it was 3, and then it was back to 2, and now they're saying, well,
they're not sure. I mean,
Musk has said there's no way that they could do it.
Right. I mean, the government, the U.S. government last year spent 6.1 trillion. And about 3.8 trillion goes to mandatory spending. And that's for things like Social Security or Medicare, Medicaid. These are things that would be really hard politically to move on. And then another 1.6 trillion goes to defense spending and activities. So there's not a lot of room to maneuver. I mean, what would they end up cutting? I mean, they were talking about trying to get more people who work in the government to come into the office, because that wastes millions, but not billions, and certainly not trillions. So they're supposed to come up with a plan by July of 2026, and I don't know what is going to be made of that. But Elon Musk famously said on the campaign trail, there's going to be more not harm, but there's going to be some suffering.
Yeah.
Before there's good times, so to speak. But I think for Musk himself, I mean, he's benefiting greatly from this relationship. And I think some of these other, major titans are as well, because, they know he's just incredibly transactional. Trump will deregulate businesses. They'll have lower taxes, and Trump's tax breaks that he implemented in 2017 cost the U.S. $4 trillion in debt, is what was added to the U.S. national debt. But he's probably going to go ahead with even more aggressive tax breaks that will benefit people like this.
Yeah, they've been saying that Musk now is due to have an office in, is it the Eisenhower building, Roosevelt building? That's directly across it's part of the executive office. So he's going to have an office in the president's sort of, not directly in the West Wing, but in the president's orbit. The question is whether he's going to have access to the president's Oval Office. That hasn't been clarified yet. But the sort of interesting thing there is Elon Musk's companies, SpaceX and his other companies, have billions and billions of dollars worth of contracts with the U.S. government, over which he's going to be overseeing in many ways, and have direct influence.
Major conflict of interest.
Yes. So this gets to this oligarchy sort of question about, does this start to make the U.S. look like an oligarchy in that sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it had already been struggling with these kind of issues, because there's inequality in the U.S. expanded over time. I mean, it's really gotten worse and worse, where the average CEO is making so much more than the average worker, at a far even faster rate than the UK. And this is sort of expediting this process.
Yeah. So one of the things I don't, I sort of wrestle with about this is, right, so we have Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Zuckerberg, the billionaire types, sitting behind the ex-presidents at Trump's inauguration, whispering in his ear, right? And this is being done in public, right? Everybody sees this. Yet, at the same time, all the rhetoric is the populist, nationalist rhetoric of, oh, we're in this for the working class, and we're gonna have policies that really help the common person and all that. Is this a circle that can't be squared? I mean, what is that?
I mean, it's completely amazing that they're able to do this, but they're far better at political communication than the Democrats are. They know how to communicate a message that is simple, clear, and easy to understand, using plain language that the Democrats fail to do, and the Democrats, get caught up into all kinds of messes by I mean, they'll get stuck with one particular issue that is really, really unpopular, but maybe they think that they've got to cater to that or this. They do not know how to, the Democrats really don't know how to communicate to the American public at all. They're terrible at it. And Biden was a pretty bad political communicator, because there were a lot of things that he actually accomplished. He couldn't communicate it. He couldn't really articulate why Trump was going to be bad for the average US citizen, and why he didn't really care about the, average American. Whereas Trump's strength, and this really is, to me, his only strength, is in marketing, and marketing himself, and communicating ideas that resonate with the public, even as they see he is this, because remember, J.D. Vance had famously said, when there was all these celebrities parading around supporting Kamala Harris, that American public doesn't want some sort of rich, millionaire or billionaire telling them what to do. He didn't understand the irony of it, right?
Yeah, and J.D. Vance is a millionaire because he went off to
Silicon Valley.
Silicon Valley. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, a good friend of mine and co-author David Barker did some of the early work on political talk radio in the U.S. He did anybody heard of Rush Limbaugh, right? He was the first sort of far right sort of political talk radio person in the U.S. to really capture the market. And one of the things that David found was that on the right, because a lot of political psychology shows you this, people on the far right tend to see the world as black and white, right and wrong. And so it's very easy to communicate then. If you're saying we're right, they're wrong, that's it. Whereas people on the left see the world in shades of gray, and they feel like they always need to explain and give the details and the nuance, and then your messaging is lost, right? As soon as you have to sort of, and then but the other side has a point, right? This is Diana Mutz's research on hearing the other side, right? If you sit there and say, well, we should listen to the other side, that tends to make people sort of go, oh,
make concessions.
Really? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. So I'm going to check my watch periodically, because I do want to come and take a few questions from the audience here. But so in a year and a half, we will suddenly hear all the conversation switch to talking about elections in the US again, right? I mean, it won't even take that long before we start talking about elections in the US again. So we'll have the midterm elections in 2 years. So in a bit more than a year from now, the primaries will start. And why is Joni Ernst suddenly changing on Pete Hegseth? Because this is a Republican senator from Iowa. Why is she suddenly, who said that she was opposed to Trump's nominee for Secretary of Defense? She switched because they've threatened to primary her in 2026, right? And to kick her out of office. So what are going to be, if we think forward, what are going to be the success stories in a year and a half for the Trump administration? What are they going to go on the campaign? This is really not a fair question. What are they going to go on the campaign trail with, saying, this is what we've accomplished in the last year and a half?
Chris, it just doesn't matter. He doesn't have to tell the truth. He can just say whatever's on the top of his head. He can say it's the greatest economy we've ever seen. He started saying that before he took office, after he was elected, that the economy's already looking better.
To be fair, Republicans did suddenly think
the Republicans thought it was looking better.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. He has an unbelievable talent to lie and to come up with the most exaggerated statements about how great and wonderful he is and how great and wonderful his policies are. He doesn't have to have anything to back it up. He makes up facts and figures, extemporaneously while it's coming into his head. He said that this was actually a great way of talking. This was the weave. And the weave was this sort of way he kind of weaved through one topic to another. And he said that the audience loved it. So it doesn't matter if he's had no accomplishments, as long as he keeps telling his supporters that everything is great, I think they're going to think it is great.
Wow. That's an interesting thought on it. Goodness.
Well, the economy in some ways is going well, right?
Yeah, well, that's it.
Right?
He's inheriting a fantastic,
economy.
yeah.
It's just that there is some inflation, and having been back, I don't know how often you were back in the US this year. I was just back there in December. It is more expensive in the grocery store in the US. It's like twice as much. I think it's about twice as much. It's expensive. And, every day you're confronted with this, and that's going to weigh on you on how you make decisions about things. I mean, there's really low unemployment, pretty solid growth rates. Stock market had been doing relatively well. So the economy looks good on a number of different ways, but that thing of inflation was something when he was being effective, he was seizing upon that issue.
So last question before we see whatever. So think of questions. On domestic policy, we're going to turn to foreign policy in a bit. So we'll keep to domestic for now. The Trump inheriting one of the strongest economies that a president has inherited sort of in the last several presidencies brings us to spare a thought for Joe Biden.
Okay.
It's been announced tonight, Joe Biden is giving his farewell address, probably about 1 o'clock in the morning, our time. He will give his farewell address from the Oval Office to the nation, to the US. Any thoughts on how the Biden administration is going to be remembered?
Probably a mixed legacy. I mean, there were huge achievements in targeting child poverty with the CHIPS Act and infrastructure bills, with in the environment. There was a lot of environmental regulations and support that he offered, and he just wasn't able, though, to talk about some of these improvements that he was making to healthcare, to fighting poverty, to the environment, to abortion access, because of course the famous thing that happened in 2022 with the overturning of Roe v. Wade. But he had passed some executive orders to improve abortion access and reproductive rights. So these were all some good things, and he was actually pretty aggressive in the beginning, trying to get through these massive bills, in the midst of COVID, and the U.S. avoided a recession. I mean, they thought for sure that there was going to be a recession because of the complete and total mismanagement of COVID by Trump, but they avoided it with a lot of spending, which of course in the end, coupled with the war going on in Ukraine, led to rising levels of inflation and the supply chain issues with China. Those are some of the positives. I mean, the negatives were his inability to say he was going to step down in 2022. And he tried to salvage it by stepping down at the last minute. And I think a lot of Democrats rallied around him that this was really a magnanimous decision, that we haven't really seen too many politicians do something like this. But he put Kamala Harris, or whoever was going to come after him, in a very precarious, very difficult situation by not stepping down earlier and announcing I was going to be like a bridge president, trying to beat Donald Trump, which he did. I think that in itself was good. The appointment of Merrick Garland, that was a really bad decision. I mean, who would have known how bad that was going to be?
Right.
But he moved way too slowly on those court cases. He was appointed attorney general, and he was moving like a turtle. It was
right, so they didn't bring
slow.
the cases against Trump until 2022,
slow.
right? So they waited 2 years. I mean, the investigation took 2 years
slow.
before they.
Yeah, Trump, waited out the clock.
Yeah.
And I mean, we can see with the recent documents detailing what had happened when Jack Smith, releasing his documents about the cases that Trump had broken the law, and had this move much quicker, then Trump probably would not have been reelected. He probably would be in prison. And it's somewhere about, just even looking at the New York State case, about half of the people that commit a similar crime would go to prison, but because he's the president-elect, he got unconditional discharge.
Yeah.
And so the other thing is Biden could have done more with the Voting Rights Act, with, protecting voting rights. So there were some key things that he didn't do. But by how slow, I'm repeating this again, how slow Merrick Garland moved. Trump announced that he was running for president again, way before a candidate normally does.
Oh, yeah.
He did it so that any court case against him would be pursued or perceived as a conflict of interest.
Yeah. So one thing Biden did do actually is he's now getting close to surpassing, or has surpassed maybe, Trump on judicial appointments.
Yeah.
So he has.
There's been a flurry of appointments.
I mean, interestingly, he's both Trump and Biden managed to nominate and get appointed more people than, as you said, Obama did during his 8 years. I think my view has always been that Biden, there's this whole thing about, was he too old to run for president again? And my sense was that he was, in many ways, he was too old to even make the case for himself. Over his entire presidency. I mean, president's supposed to be the chief salesperson, right? They're supposed to get out and sell their policies, and he just never did that.
He couldn't do it.
No.
He had moments where he would have a good State of the Union speech, but he had a terrible debate, and then it just went downhill from there. I think he was actually more coherent after he dropped out of the race, and it just wasn't a stressor for him. But there were definitely a lot of missteps, and he was in charge when the Supreme Court just became overwhelmingly partisan. I mean, I didn't get to this during the autocratization part, but the July 1st ruling, where the Supreme Court basically ruled that a president is immune from any presidential acts. Basically, they can do whatever they want to do. It was just astounding. Yeah. And Trump will take advantage of that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Right. So we'll take about 2 or 3 questions now, and then we'll talk a bit about foreign policy, and then we'll come back for the general Q&A. But I just wanted to take a quick breather. You've heard a lot from us. And of course, somebody up at the back has their hand up, so Sam has to run all the way up the stairs there. Thank you, Sam.
Hi, so thank you for that. That was really, really interesting. Just a question. You said there about, you were talking about Trump's comments about being a dictator on day one. And you said he wouldn't be like Putin, he'd be more like Viktor Orban. Now, I mean, I agree with you, and I do think that he will look more like Viktor Orban than Vladimir Putin. But one of the reasons why Orban has been kind of somewhat restrained in what he's done, he doesn't lock up his political opponents, he doesn't throw his political opponents out of windows yet, is largely because he is constrained by the European Union. He can't go too far in terms of being too obviously nakedly a dictator. Trump obviously doesn't have that. So is there a possibility that because, obviously there isn't this kind of restraint on Trump as the leader of the most powerful country in the world, that he might just be able to say like, well, I'm the president of the United States, so I can do whatever I want. So up yours.
So
great question.
So guardrails, basically, right? So what?
I mean, I would like to think there are certainly way more guardrails in the U.S. than in Russia, where power is deeply personalized in Putin's own hands, where he's just completely politicized the judiciary under his control, and where all the security institutions are under his control as well. And they either share his worldview or they are afraid to. And there's a long, long history, of course, in Russia and the Soviet Union of authoritarianism and very brutal forms of repression that are used on their own citizens, with, you know, the elites that surround Putin are also completely in lockstep with what he wants to do. And the public is happy to look the other way because they fear that they themselves could be put in prison. So I don't think you'd ever see something like if you say the word special operation, instead of saying the word special operation, you say the war in Ukraine, you go to prison for 25 years. I don't think we would see anything like this. I mean, there are still, as Chris mentioned, loads of federal judges that are trying to engage in their own forms of resistance. There is still enough of a democratic political culture that I think would push against that. Though that in itself has been degrading. So we have to see how far it's willing to put up with Trump. So I would say that the rule of law in the US is far more democratic than in the Russian case. But you're right, there isn't, you know, a European Union. And I think there are way fewer guardrails this go around than before, because at least in the first term, Trump kind of didn't know he was going to win. So he kind of was surrounding himself by people who the Republican Party were telling him to surround himself by. And this time he doesn't want any of those people. He wants really the most sycophantic, loyal people. He keeps repeating that over and over again. And we'll have to see what they're willing to get, you know, to do and to get away with. But often these populist style leaders, which I differentiate from personalist leaders, even though there's a lot of similarities there, they care more about being loved than about repressing. They're more willing to use other forms of aggression, repression on their political opponents than actually killing people. And overall, the level of repression that dictators use has decreased. They use it very, very selectively. It's not like the same levels of repression than in the past. There are not a lot of huge wins in doing this kind of thing. I mean, you can get away with it to some extent, but how much? I mean, it seems like it would be too big of a risk to actually kill people, to throw people out of windows and this kind of stuff. But I think I wouldn't have predicted a lot of things in American politics that I'm seeing today. So, I mean, I think anything probably is possible, but I would still bet that it's unlikely.
Yeah, I regularly complain in teaching American politics that I have to rewrite all of my lectures because all the things that I said, you know, a couple of years back saying, well, that'll never happen. Well,
and it happens, yeah.
Now it happens. So I have to, you know, Trump's made my life very difficult.
Yeah,
to rewrite my
exactly.
I can't bring in those old overhead slides like I used to have and all that sort of stuff anymore.
Everything
right?
has to be updated all the time.
Yeah. So in the first administration too, there were some guardrails which still exist. You know, the state's attorney general, they'll push back. So we'll see that the state's pushing back against the Trump
States,
administration.
governors, district attorneys, the civil service more generally has been pushing back. You know, there've been all kinds of civil suits against Trump.
But that's why Trump wants to clear out the civil service, right?
Exactly.
So the president appoints around 8,000 civil servants, or can appoint up to about 8,000 civil servants every time the president changes over. And like usually they don't. Usually they just leave, you know, a fair few of those people in from the previous administration because they're just civil servants. They do their job. But Trump wants to not only clean out those 8,000, but also put in what's called Schedule F, which will allow him to just hire and fire at will. So that'll be a problem.
Incredibly bad for a civil service to have these staccato careers where you're in and out and you never develop expertise and experience and that you are partisan.
Well, the classic idea of the civil service, it's supposed to be meritocracy.
Meritocracy, and professionalized.
Right, and another question, and then we'll talk about foreign policy. Down.
You've both greeted the prospect of President Trump with horror. I think not least because I think you suspect that in some ways he's going to succeed. So let me challenge the second bit of your thesis. One of the classic studies of American politics, of course, was Dick Neustadt's presidential power. And the crucial message of Dick Neustadt's presidential power, which all politicians need to know, is that you need to know what is going wrong before anybody else. And isn't the fundamental risk that Trump is taking in surrounding himself with people of like mind is that he will know too late what's going wrong, and therefore, as a result, will not necessarily be a particularly effective president.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's one of the biggest issues, because I study dictatorships, and one of the biggest issues for these personalist style dictators that typically are so threatened, they're so worried about their own political survival, they're worried about coups, and they then surround themselves by those that are the most loyal, those that have very little expertise, and those that are going to tell them what they want to hear. And so they engage in all kinds of false reporting. So the quality of military intelligence of these personalist style leaders is very, very low. So historically, they do very, very bad. These types of countries led by these types of leaders perform very badly in conflict, whether it be Saddam Hussein, who was surrounded by people telling him that the war was going great. He's making his decisions to invade Iran and Kuwait basically in isolation. Then with the second Gulf War is being told, yeah, everything's going great, and that the Iraqis can't live without him. And they end up, having a very bitter, long, and protracted end. The same thing happened with Gaddafi in Libya. I mean, he invaded 6 out of 7 of his neighbors. They didn't win it. They even lost a battle to Chad, which is one of the poorest countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Similar battle performance for other countries led by personalist style leaders when Idi Amin invaded Tanzania, and quickly they were trounced. To apply this to Putin, because he's purged so many of the best and brightest, that's why this war is going as I mean, yes, they are still doing well, but they should have been able to take over Ukraine much, much quicker than they had, but they just have very little expertise. And that's definitely the danger that Trump's administration will be facing. That the adults in the room, that was the expression you kept hearing all over and over again. There's adults in the room, and there are no adults in the room. So what on earth is he going to do? And his Secretary of Defense, if he does get through the appointment process, Pete Hegseth, I mean, that's an $800 billion enterprise that he's going to be in charge of 3 million employees. And he was a weekend anchor at Fox News.
Who ran 2 nonprofits, both which employed around 20 people into the ground.
Right.
Because he was
A couple dozen people, but that's who is going to be his Secretary of Defense. I mean, it's scary to think what's going to happen, but then at the same time, Trump could end up doing nothing. And then, sometimes doing nothing is almost fine enough, I guess.
I think, John, part of the premise of your question is underlying it is the idea that the president wants to maintain in some way the status quo and or political order. The problem here with Trump and his administration is they specifically want to come in and be what they call disruptors. They say they're perfectly happy to burn it all down. They want to dismantle the Department of Education. They want to, so you don't actually have to know what's going on. You have to know how to make it all go wrong. If you in that sense, if you want, right? Now, to be fair, to dismantle a department, you kind of have to know what's going on in order to be able to dismantle it, et cetera, et cetera. But
that's a good point, because you mentioned like they put people in charge of departments that want to get rid of those departments. Like when he put Rick Perry in charge of Department of Energy, and he famously couldn't name that department when asked, or putting Linda McMahon in charge of Department of Education, where she believed in charter schools, or his appointments for the basically would be the Department of the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department for the Environment, that don't believe in climate change.
Yeah. So if we go way back to Ronald Reagan, right? Reagan appointed Actually, the mother of now Justice Gorsuch, she was appointed to dismantle the EPA. And basically Reagan didn't want to know anything about the EPA. He said, just go take care of it, right? So I think I take the point, but on the other hand, if you're trying to disrupt, then Trump's perfectly happy to tell people just go do it. I think to some extent. Right, so we're going to switch to foreign policy just a bit, and then we'll come back for more questions. So three big issues to talk about in terms of foreign policy. Probably the most obvious one that you've now mentioned, Ukraine. What is going to be the Trump administration approach to dealing with Ukraine? We got various stories during the campaign again about that. What do you think?
So first, I just want to lay out what I think Trump's strengths are in foreign policy. And I think I probably shouldn't have used the word strengths. He does not understand what's going on in the world. He's blissfully ignorant. So his Secretary of State, former Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, said that it was a good day if they could get through a one-page document with bullet points, and Trump didn't lose his attention span. That it was so difficult for him to understand the complexity of foreign relations, to understand that alliances weren't nuisances, that our allies are helpful. They're not people that you need to try to extract from. So I think he has a very limited and simplistic understanding of the world and doesn't understand what's going on in the Middle East at all, Ukraine, Russia, none of these things. But he thinks he does, and he thinks he's a great deal maker. And so his approach to Ukraine, which has gone in many different directions, he did appoint Keith Kellogg, who was a decorated three-star general, who has been at different times vocal of supporting Ukraine. And I think the initial idea was that they would provide Ukraine with quite a bit of military aid to entice them to come to the negotiating table. But then once at the negotiation table, Ukraine might have to capitulate quite a bit of territory. There would be some sort of demilitarized zone where troops would be there, and these troops would most likely be European. Europe would definitely be footing the bill, not the US. And in exchange, Ukraine might get some reduced energy products from Russia. But essentially, Russia would be getting all that it wanted. It would get, Ukrainian territory, and there would also be a promise to put on pause Ukraine ever joining NATO. Now, this document, which wasn't official, was never officially given to the Russians, but the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, already said that this did not meet Russian expectations. And so it's, even though they're giving Russia almost everything, Russia's already saying this isn't really good enough. So I think it will be nearly impossible for Trump to come up with a deal. He originally said 24 hours. Now he says it's going to take months. It will be very, very difficult. So he had famously said that he was going to resolve the healthcare crisis in the US in no time.
Yeah,
And then he said, oh, whoever knew that healthcare could be so complicated? And I think he's going to say something similar. Whoever knew that conflict resolution could be so complicated? He never really presided over any crises, with the exception of COVID, which he famously bungled and mismanaged. So this will be a test for him, and I don't think he's going to be able to figure out how to resolve it. He also is so obsessed with impressing Putin. He just loves Vladimir Putin, and he doesn't want to upset him, I think. And so he's already laying out all of his cards, which you're not supposed to do when you negotiate. And this is a mistake because actually Putin is running out of men. I mean, they're killing 1,500 troops a day, at least in the month of October, we're dying. I have several Russian students. They are getting just constantly plagued with requests to join the Russian military. They are trying to bring in mercenaries from North Korea, from Yemen, or from wherever.
Yeah. Well, they have brought in from North Korea.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. And they are not coming from a position of strength, but Putin knows that the resolve of The Europeans is low. I was looking at public resolve, and on average, looking at 7 countries, the resolve to keep supporting Ukraine, no matter how long, is down to about 30%. And in the US, it's gone down a lot too. And it's well over 2/3 of the Republican Party that don't want to keep going on with this, both within the party and also the public. So I think that eventually the aid is going to stop. And there was one article that said, within a year and a half, a year, that will be it. And Russia will be able to control Ukraine, or at least have almost control of Ukraine. And that really ultimately is what Putin would want.
Goodness, that's sobering. On to then another one that will probably be, I imagine, giving your tone
It's going to be, yeah.
is not going to be a whole bunch of roses either. Israel-Palestine situation in Gaza. What's going to be the Trump administration approach to that, do you think?
Well, he's very pro-Israeli, but he also very pro-Netanyahu. And Netanyahu had bragged that he was able to convince Trump to leave the Iran nuclear deal just by, convincing him. And I think Netanyahu thinks, and this is similar to what Putin thinks, that he can just manipulate Trump pretty easily with certain facts and flattery. Trump is going to appoint the ambassador to Israel will be Mike Huckabee, who is very pro-settlement. So I would think that you would see just a continuation, but even more green lights to Israel, to Netanyahu to do what he wants to do. And for Netanyahu, his political survival is based on this war continuing. I know there's been a lot of pressure coming from Israelis who want the hostages to come back. And are upset with his government that they've not been able to do this. But as long as this war keeps going on, and of course then the war expanded at one point into Lebanon, it is a distraction from the trials that he was facing.
Is there? Yeah, so just this morning there was the discussion about release of hostages.
So I
Yeah.
mean, I don't think it will hold that long.
Right.
I mean, because we've been having these ceasefire, they've been calling talks for these ceasefires. And then at the last minute, Netanyahu would say that there were, complications or issues. I know he didn't want to have the announcement of the ceasefire before the election.
Right.
But I don't see how this is going to hold unless there's a genuine resolution to the deep issues that they have there. I would expect it would not.
Right, so the ceasefire is based on the release of a certain number of hostages
And
now,
prisoners.
and then, yeah, so I suppose that's part of the question. Right. Right, okay, so last one before we go to general Q&A. Does Trump really want to buy Greenland? And would he really use the US military to seize the Panama Canal?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think we had actually talked about this earlier, that there was going to be the release of documents about his court, his legal battles. And he was able to shift the narrative by talking about Greenland, which seemed completely insane. But, they were saying, oh, well, but there are hydrocarbons in Greenland and the US has a base there. And that there are some reasons, strategic reasons why the US might want to acquire Greenland. And then with the Panama Canal, or, there's 5% of global maritime trade goes through the Panama Canal. It's about 2.5 billion in revenues for Panama. I think it's a distraction. I think he's trying to get better deals, maybe to get Denmark to improve their security, maybe to get Panama to lessen the amount of taxes to go through for shipping to go through, and to get a better deal than what he thinks the Chinese are getting. I think it's some kind of negotiation tactic, but also really bluster to shift the attention away from.
Yeah, it's interesting that Trump, being the climate denier, also has said, well, for whatever reason, you can now do a lot more mining in Greenland than you could previously. Wonder what the reason is.
Right.
You can actually, that's the sort of, so there has been reporting in the last couple days that Greenland actually through back channels has said to the incoming Trump administration We are perfectly happy to talk about more U.S. military access to Greenland and about, opening up mineral rights and these sorts of things. Please just stop saying that you want to buy it.
Right, yeah. But
So-
remember, he joked about Canada becoming the 51st state.
Yeah.
And he did it, so supposedly when Trudeau was still Prime Minister of Canada, he talked about it over 50 times. And it was part of this sort of bullying, repetitive way of just getting under Trudeau's skin. It was supposed to be coming across as joking, but it's a way of disarming, disorienting his opponents as a negotiation tactic, that you're sort of so unsettled by this that you feel weakened when you go to the negotiation table.
Right. Should we open it up to questions? From there?
Given Trump's role as a great disruptor, as he would have it, why or does he want to dismantle NATO? And if so, why?
He does want to dismantle NATO. I mean, he's been trying to say that he would dismantle NATO. He could at least take US troops out of Europe and not fund NATO as much. He has been saying that it's not fair, that everybody in NATO needs to spend 2% of their GDP on their military. And he's claimed, and some other experts have claimed, that he's been more successful at trying to get European allies to do their fair share. But I think it's mainly because he doesn't understand the way alliances work. He thinks that it's the US that is being burdened. The US is giving and not getting much back. And that's why he sees NATO to be a problem. And like we said, like this role of sort of disrupting these regional, regional or intergovernmental organizations and institutions. And this is actually in line with some of the far right leaders in Europe as well, that have been connecting with Moscow and that share a worldview that NATO is a huge threat to global security because it basically pushed Russia into a corner and forced it to attack Ukraine. So there is a view out there which Trump shares, that NATO is not worth it. And they NATO proofed it. The Congress NATO proofed it that we can't leave NATO, but he can certainly weaken it.
I think I would just come in. I think it's very easy to start, particularly from our perspective here, to think that Trump isn't particularly clever, but he is, right? In some ways, right? About the sort of his kind of ways of, he knows he's putting everybody, on a sugary peg, right? Yeah, he's trying to make sure that nobody really knows where they stand. And I think this then takes us back to this question from the first administration. Do we take him seriously or do we take him literally? And we never resolved that question with Trump administration number 1, and I don't think we're going to resolve that question with Trump administration number 2. Is he being serious about, I don't like NATO, I want to take it apart? Or is he saying basically, I'm using this as a negotiation tactic, as leverage in order to get NATO members to pay up more? And sometimes I think I suspect that we honestly don't really know the extent to which he really wants to.
I don't think he knows.
Well, that's the other thing, right? So the other thing we do know is that Susie Wiles, who's going to be his chief of staff, she has said that this administration is going to be run, and she's going to run it with a sort of iron fist. This administration is going to be run very differently, in that she is going to limit the number of people who have the title assistant to the president, which is the title that you need to be able to walk into the Oval Office without first going through the chief of staff, right? So the fact that you could just walk into the office, in the first administration, like everybody and their mother's brother had it, this title. But she's going to limit it because the understanding, and I think you were sort of hinting at this earlier, Natasha, that the idea, people quickly realized in the first administration that whoever was the last person in the room with Trump often got their way, and that he is quite mercurial, in his positions, and he doesn't really have that a hard and fast ideological view of things, and so he's willing to be swayed, and he sees this as a strength. And so Susie Wiles has said, no, we're not doing that anymore. We're going to make it so that everything has to come through, her as a gatekeeper, effectively. So I think to some extent there's that sort of plays into this whole thing about who's going to be in the room and who is going to be talking to him and what are the positions. And I guess maybe that goes back to sort of John's point as well. Sam, I'm going to send you all the way up in the back. Sorry. And then we'll start working our way down forward. Keep going all the way.
Hi, just a few questions. I was listening to President-elect Trump today. I don't know whether it was live or whether it was a recording, but he was saying some interesting things about Greenland. He was questioning, whether Denmark legitimately owned it. Could Greenland claim independence or have a referendum on independence? Could it become another state of America? So technically, I wouldn't dismiss anything he does. And you're talking there about Gaza there the now. He did say the other day there that before Monday, he wanted a ceasefire in the Middle East, and that's one being arranged today. So is that respect or fear of Trump, or was that Joe Biden's last success, getting a ceasefire? So I think there's a lot of character assassination goes on, and I think you've really got to look, what is the practical policies that are going to get put in place, and how is it going to affect, for instance, the UK? Because it seems to be a lot of looking at personalities rather than looking at policies. So that always concerns me, and maybe that's why people that haven't got university degrees maybe vote for a President Trump, because simply they can only look at the food on their table and how much it's cost them, because everything else is basically gossip in a lot of ways.
Well, that is an interesting point, because pretty much most of the studies now are showing that it really was those sort of economic factors that drove the pro-Trump vote, sort of as Natasha was saying about how expensive things are and how high inflation was in the US and how slow prices are to come down. I'll jump in on Greenland and then I'll let you come in.
So because I was trying to hear the question about the first part of the question was about the ceasefire or
that was the second part. So I'll let you deal with the ceasefire, but the Greenland one was, so Greenland has said, Trump has said, well, Greenland could declare independence and then it could join us as a 51st state.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, just as a non sequitur sideline, I actually had a journalist asking me yesterday if Trump would be willing to sort of come after Scotland, because of his golf courses as well. Scotland declared independence. I think the issue there is that his name is jumping out of my head. Mute, whatever, the basically First Minister for Greenland has said that they do want to be independent. We know this. There's a long-running independence sort of campaign in Greenland. It's a country of 57,000 people, but that if they became independent, they'd want to be independent, that there is almost no appetite in Greenland for joining the US or any other country. They would like to be an independent country in their own right. So I don't, if we just listen to the Greenlanders, I don't think there's much of an appetite for them to join anybody if they declare independence. I would think that that's an issue there.
Can you repeat the question, because I couldn't hear it?
Right. It's just to say for context, it's very difficult actually, because the sound bounces off this wall and goes that way. And so if you're sitting here, it's really always hard to. So about the ceasefire was a ceasefire partially because Trump is coming in. I think I'm getting this right. So it's
Biden's work. I mean, we had heard that Biden's team, particularly after he dropped out of the race, was working 24/7 on some kind of ceasefire, and they really wanted it for many reasons, but also before the election because of the voters in Michigan and so forth, where there are key Arab American voters that just said they couldn't support Biden after this. So there was a lot of work on this. So I had been some work that I've been doing with a Lebanese scholar was saying that there was just no way that Netanyahu was going to give Biden a win before the election. Absolutely no way. Because Netanyahu would prefer Trump being in power for reasons that I had already outlined. And that now that since this has happened, that they could pursue something like a ceasefire. But I mean, circling back to what I'd originally said, though there is a pause, I don't see a benefit for Netanyahu in having a permanent ceasefire because of the things that he's dealing with. And I don't see Trump being able to influence him. I see the other way around. But I don't see a situation where Trump will influence Netanyahu. I mean, he was very pro-Israeli when he was in power, and he moved the U.S. embassy famously from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which he knew would have implications and there would be backlash. And I think the other thing he's probably going to be trying to do is improve Israeli relations with some of the other Gulf states that haven't yet recognized Israel. And he thought that the Abraham Accords was one of his signature pieces. And I think he'll be more focused on that because these are they're huge business deals that can come out of this.
I'm thinking a bit of the Iranian hostage crisis with Carter and Reagan.
Yeah.
And so, the Carter administration had worked very hard to try to negotiate the release of the hostages. But it really wasn't until after Reagan was elected that sort of flipped over. And part of the argument was that the Iranians held out until after they knew that they could sort of claim that they had turned out Carter in favor of Reagan.
The day of his inauguration,
Yeah.
literally the day.
They released the hostages. So it could be, I don't think we know enough now to be able to rule out that there's not some fear that Trump might come in and goodness gracious, we don't know what's going to happen then. So it's quite possible that there is a bit of the fear of what Trump may or may not do in that uncertainty thing with some of it.
Yeah, but I see him as being very pro-Israeli and wanting, to allow Netanyahu to do what he wants to do.
Yeah, and even Trump, I mean, certainly J.D. Vance is very pro-Israeli, and most of the Republicans in Congress are very much pro-Israel as well.
And also the Israeli cabinet is very right-wing at the moment. There's about 2 cabinet members that Biden administration had complained about that they were saying that they can't get anything done because these 2 were saying that they were pressuring Netanyahu to not to do this or that because it would be not in line with the goals of annihilating Hamas.
Yeah. Right. So we were going to just work our way back. So. Yep.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I have a question regarding, I guess, the internal factionalism within the whole MAGA project. I mean, we've seen, Mike Johnson has been elected with a bit of a hiccup. We see already, the internal sort of a civil war is already, ramping on. So how much, attention should we pay on this? Should we, how seriously should we take all this? I mean, should we basically go into full kind of a criminology kind of a mode of, which faction has now currently the overheads, or is this just noise?
So factionalism, in particularly within the Republicans, within Congress, really. But then we've already seen the sort of Steve Bannon, who was a previous sort of advisor to President Trump in the first administration, is attacking the bejeebers out of Elon Musk.
They don't. I mean, they really don't like.
They really don't like each other. So we see these splits within the Republican coalition. How is that? Does Trump just basically tell them to work it out?
Well, he stands above the fray, right? While they just kind of duke it out amongst each other. I don't think that even really bothers him that much. But
as long as they're all loyal to him.
As long as they're all loyal to him, that's all that matters. If they are fighting over, H-1B visas, that basically Elon Musk wants to allow skilled labor to come in through a quicker visa process, and Bannon doesn't. So there'll be all kinds of spectacular fights within the Republican Party But as long as everybody remains loyal to Trump, that's all he cares about.
I think part of the issue is, of course, that Trump has put together in the MAGA thing is a sort of big tent coalition, right? He's put together the sort of tech bros. He's wrangled in the sort of old school Republicans, those left of him who are anti-debt,
Conservative fiscally.
fiscally conservative. He's also brought in the people who want the massive tax cuts. On the other hand, Steve Bannon, the populist, wants massive tax increases. And so, you know, trying to within Congress, how that's going to play out is going to be a problem. The person who's going to have the biggest problem with that is not Trump. It's Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, in trying to get, you know, the three Republicans who can't defect at all, otherwise they lose every vote, and do not want him talking to the Democrats is going to be his big problem. I think Trump's just going to stand above it and just tell them to sort it out, I suspect is what's going to happen. Just in front of him then.
Just a comment. It's a bit ironic that, given the emphasis in the campaign that Trump placed on the price of groceries and cost of living, that there has been virtually no talk about that in recent weeks. And what I understand is that he realizes that he really can't bring down the price of things once inflation has hit. So I don't know how long it will take for folks to get a bit restive about that. But my actual question was about the foreign policy issues. And it has struck me that the reactions of leaders of other countries to Trump has surprised me. And the term anticipatory obedience comes to mind, that it seems as if the world is sort of cowing to Trump. It surprises me. I don't know if it surprises you. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
It definitely surprised me, the speed with which everybody just sort of gave up and said, okay, this is who we have to deal with. But I guess it's similar to the way these big tech titans have dealt with him, that it's better. I think they think they are better off working, negotiating with him, flattering him, telling him what he wants here. I know in Ukraine in particular, Zelensky was saying all kinds of flattering things to him, and it was obvious that it was, you know, to just make the right impression. But the US is still a very powerful country, and they don't have a choice. And, you know, at any moment in time, Trump could levy these horrible tariffs that could really affect another country's economy. The US in particular has such a huge impact on the economies in Latin America, the economy in Canada. They're so interrelated and interconnected, and definitely also even the European economies to some extent. So because they don't want this kind of thing to happen, they're hoping they can work with him to avoid something catastrophic.
But again, Mexico has pushed back, and the president of Mexico is not invited to attend the inauguration. And Canada, obviously, Trudeau has pushed back as well. So there's been some pushback on that front as well. I think it's a bit of a mix.
Right, but I mean, those two cases were cases where they were attacked. I mean, so I think the other cases we're referring to is where nothing had happened as of yet. And so then once you face the attack, I guess you have to kind of come up with a response, I guess. But people are anticipating, they're hoping that they don't get attacked. So then they're trying to, like you said, cower to Trump.
Right. We have time for one more. Can we come down here, I think? Sorry, whoops.
I think I have the perfect last question about succession. I know we're talking about the next 4 years, but what do you think will happen? I mean, there are term limits, there are life limits, right? So is this era of, US politics, soon studied by professors of history rather than professors of politics? What do you think will happen, once Trump is gone? Is this a movement that will stay, it's so personalistic, right? As you said. So what's your prediction there?
That is such a great question, because I mean, I think originally I was thinking, okay, he's just never going to leave. And he's seems to be very resilient, even though he's, older, but he has faced assassination attempts and this and that, bullets have hit his ear. Nothing is gonna bring this guy down. But he picked Vance for a reason. Vance, I think he thinks is gonna be the future of the MAGA movement. I think that once Trump is gone, it will lack its luster. I think he is a once in a lifetime kind of figure. That doesn't mean that it's going to disappear. It's part of the Republican Party. But often some of the Trump candidates haven't done quite as well when they tried to be Trump 2.0, that it didn't work quite as well. So my prediction is that it's still going to exist. It's not going to disappear, but I don't think it will have the same kind of charismatic authority that it has under Trump. What do you think?
So I'll have to sort of stream of consciousness thought on this. So Trump will be the oldest president to be inaugurated. He seems reasonably healthy, although he won't release his medical records, but he plays golf every day and at his age, which is quite something. So let's assume he makes it to 4 years. Trump right now is raising money at an alarming or impressive both rate, right? His campaign fund is raising money like you would not believe, right? They've not only just the money for the transition team, which is separate from the campaign fund, but he's raising money as if he were going to run again. Now, constitutionally, he can't run again. They can't change the Constitution. That's not going to happen. But what it does do is it sets him up to be the kingmaker in a year and a half when we go to the midterm elections, and then 4 years when we go to the next presidential election. So I don't see the Trump influence waning anytime soon. I mean, people look, think of after his last administration, right? Ends with January 6th. You have members of Republican members of Congress getting up in Congress saying, this is absolutely terrible. What a horrible person he is. That's it. We're done with him. We've washed our hands, blah, blah, blah. And within a few months, they've all started to secretly start to head down to see him in Mar-a-Lago. Within a year, they are openly going to seek his blessing in Mar-a-Lago. So he's not disappearing anytime soon, I don't think. I think he will do his best to put his stamp and shape the Republicans to come. The other thing just to note is not only is this going to be the wealthiest cabinet ever appointed, this is also going to be the youngest cabinet appointed in a very long time. So it's going to be historic in that lots and lots of young people being brought in to sort of carry on the Trump banner. I expect that what he would like to see is some sort of fight to the finish between his cabinet members that make it through the full Trump administration to see who then takes on the mantle.
I was just going to add something. I don't think his children have the same type of appeal as he has. I know he at a certain point was trying to get them involved in politics, but I don't see it like a dynasty in that sense. That
Eric maybe, but the other one's probably not. Donald Jr. not.
No.
Ivanka hasn't even been on the public stage. The other ones, Tiffany, no. So Eric Jr. keeps talking about running.
Oh gosh, I know his wife is tapped to
take over from Marco Rubio. Yeah.
Florida.
So yeah. So yes, there we go. Right. That is our time for this evening. Thank you so much for coming along. Before we thank Professor Lindstaedt, I do want to just put in that other little plug again for the 10th of February for the Scottish Youth Parliament, and then the 4th of March for. Do I need to change? I can change. Oh, we have a very handy slide here. Oh, there it is. You've already done it. So yeah, the Scottish Youth Parliament one, and then the 4th of March, Professor Sir Anton Muscatelli of this fine institution will be here as well. So with that, thank you very much, Natasha. We really appreciate it. Thank you.